Hello all and welcome to History with R&R. Welcomes Drachinifel to the channel. Welcome back, sir.
Hello.
There might be a slight echo, but there's nothing we can do about that. So just kind of deal. Today we welcome Drac back to talk about something that growing up, especially here in Canada, it was the one part of history that just kind of got skipped over. And then this happened, but meanwhile, was one of
Yes.
those moments, because it's one of those things, especially here in Canada. I don't know how it is in the rest of the world, but here in Canada, it's that sore spot that nobody talks about. It's like that one championship that you almost got to and didn't quite make it that nobody talks about. Dieppe has kind of become that thing, and as the years go on, it's amazing how many things have changed. So we're not going to really cover the land because we have Drac, so we're going to talk the naval side, which gets a lot of the blame, which I think is silly.
Yeah, I mean, there's. I think with Dieppe nowadays, we kind of have two major problems when we're trying to evaluate what happened and why. Which is, firstly, that we are somewhat influenced, in fact, quite heavily influenced by things like D-Day, Husky, and the various landings in the Pacific, which all, of course, post-date this.
Yeah.
And a lot of them build on the lessons of like what not to do, which were learned at Dieppe. And so a lot of the time you get this kind of retroactive, we did all of this really well in the second part of the war, so why didn't we get it right the first part? And then that coincides with, people not necessarily being able to compute that, sometimes things don't actually go according to plan.
Yeah.
And then you get a whole layer of various conspiracy theories as to who was responsible and why, and was there a secret objective, and all sorts of other weird and wonderful things which get in the way of
things.
Yeah, it all gets in the way of trying to work out what actually happened and the reasons for it, which, I mean, there are still some things that aren't entirely clear about the Dieppe raid, because, of course, we have to rely, apart from obviously some survivors' accounts, which are limited to what they saw and experienced, we're limited to the archival documentation. And, of course, the archival documentation was written up and submitted by a bunch of people in the aftermath of something that had gone horribly wrong. And they were perhaps a little bit creative sometimes in saying who came up with this particular idea and who didn't come up with this idea.
Well, I think, to that point, I think what they should have done is, if this had gone off properly, whose idea was it again? Because
yes,
sometimes that will change the answer of whose idea it was, how successful it was. But Dieppe, from the Navy. So what exactly was the British compliment for Dieppe?
So
within a ship or two,
there's a huge number of ships that are deployed for this. I mean, obviously, as you said, this is a big point in Canadian history, but the Canadian element was primarily the troops that were going to be landed. The naval and air element was pretty much entirely British. Yes. And it wasn't a small number of vessels either. There were well over 200 ships of various shapes and sizes present. And obviously, you're relatively close to the UK coastline as well, Dieppe being on the northern coastline of France. So things like air support and so forth, that was relied upon to be coming from the RAF. There was 0 point in bringing a carrier into the English Channel. It would just give the Germans far too much of a tempting target. And realistically, if you're operating on full-scale airfields off the south coast of the UK, you're actually probably going to get there quicker than trying to conduct air ops in the English
and not
Channel.
Only that, but the English Channel isn't exactly known for, calm and wonderful seas.
No. Well, I mean,
Canadian, I know that.
Yeah. And of course, the other thing you've got to remember with the channel is because it's so narrow in the north to south direction, if you have, if the wind, because as we know, carriers like to sail into the wind to run their operations, the carrier is either going to be running directly away from you or directly towards the beaches, neither of which are particularly ideal if the wind's north to south. If the wind is coming from the east, it's going to be heading towards German-occupied Netherlands, which isn't good. And if it's heading west, it's heading down the channel away from you and away from the rest of its support. So
not ideal.
Yeah,
and you could probably get more air arm up from the ground bases than you ever could off the carrier anyway.
Yeah, and heavier aircraft as well, bombers and so forth. So there's no fleet air arm element involved, save for whatever scouting aircraft were aboard some of the were assigned from the fleet air arm to one or two of the ships. But whilst, as we said, there are over 200 ships involved, the vast majority of these are the landing craft. Yeah. So you wouldn't traditionally rate them as naval vessels, save that somebody's got to run the things. The biggest combat vessel involved directly in the Dieppe landings was a destroyer. You do have some headquarters ships further back, but even they are still destroyers. They're just not destroyers on the front line. Then you have some minesweepers, some Coast Guard as well. In the US, you'd call them Coast Guard cutters, but in British terms, they're basically gunboats. And then you have MGBs, MTBs, motor launches, basically all the small, what in US terms would be sort of PT boats. The Germans would be S boats, that kind of fast attack craft, although the Royal Navy has this distinction between ships that are primarily armed with lots and lots of guns and not necessarily torpedoes, and the torpedo gunboats and stuff. And then the final thing is, in terms of large ships at least, is there's a series of what the British have optimistically classed as LSIs, landing ship infantry, which are essentially the motherships to most of the small craft that are actually going ashore. Now, that gives possibly a misleading idea of just how uniform these things are, because when you see LS in certain letter here, we're used to thinking about LSTs and etc., which are all mass manufactured. Again, this being a very early stage of the war, relatively speaking, most of these are steamers, freighters, and this kind of thing that have been taken over and converted to the role. Ferries quite often, but they're not in any way, shape, or form uniformly sized, uniformly shaped, or even uniformly propelled. They're just large, relatively speaking, short-range vessels, so not suitable for long-range convoy duty, where they've decided we can pack a lot of men into these, and they happen to have either have or have been fitted with a lot of davits to allow you to deploy landing craft from them.
Okay. So there is a few myths that I want to kind of dispel, and I think the best person to do it would be you. And growing up, like I say, especially in Canada, one of the biggest myths of the Dieppe raid is if only the British had deployed a battleship or a major capital unit, the Dieppe raids would have succeeded. And looking at the raid from as many point of views as I could growing up, I never could put my finger on what in the blue hell a battleship or two would change the outcome. I don't see it.
Yeah, well, there is a case to be made that perhaps a heavier amount of naval gunfire support would have reduced casualties, because ultimately the ships that were assigned to the gunfire support were a bunch of Hunt-class destroyers. So you're talking about 4-inch guns, 105 millimeter weapons. That's kind of medium field artillery for land-based purposes, which, okay, it's not pleasant to be on the receiving end of, but there's certainly a lot worse that you could be shot at by even on land. And one of the key features of naval bombardment is usually it's overwhelming in terms of its firepower compared to what you'd normally experience on land. So, a town class cruiser with 12 6-inch guns, 152 millimeter, would be considerably scarier. And of course, a battleship, whether that be an old one with 15, like an older R class, or maybe something a bit newer with 14 or 16-inch guns, obviously the R's with 15-inch, it would make a bit of an impression. Certainly it would curtail German operations, cause more German casualties. But fundamentally, the problem wasn't so much the ability or inability to kill Germans. It was the beaches themselves and the technology that was being deployed at the time, particularly just the structure of the beaches. If you look at the Dieppe beach, not just the material itself, it's mostly kind of a shingle pebble type beach. It's not a pure sand beach. That caused all sorts of problems for the armor that was landed, because they were sensible enough to think, okay, we're going to need tank support. But then it turns out that even a Churchill, which in most circumstances legendarily can go anywhere, just not very fast, still struggled, and the other vehicles that were deployed struggled quite a lot on these beaches. Because it's fairly easy to think about, even if you, and I had this experience myself last week when I was down on the south coast, if you run on a sand beach, it takes a lot more energy and is a lot more tiring than if you're running on normal ground. But if you're running on a pebble beach, particularly a relatively fine pebble or gravel beach, A, you don't go anywhere fast, and B, it absolutely shatters you. And it's the same thing for vehicles. So, heavy naval gunfire isn't going to turn that beach into a compact sand beach.
No.
And then, of course, there's a bunch of fairly famous photos of the aftermath, and you see that a lot of the beaches have these massive seawalls right behind them.
Yeah.
Now, in theory, yes, if you got very lucky, accurate heavy naval gunfire might blow a hole in those. But all that's really going to do is create a choke point that the German defenders can sort of circle around and deal with. And again, when you look at most of the sort of the pictures of vehicles that have got bogged down, whether they be wheeled vehicles, tracked vehicles, all the heavy support stuff, they never got anywhere near those walls in the first place. So, yeah, I think heavy naval gunfire might have reduced the casualties because there would be fewer Germans shooting back and more Germans are taking cover. It's not going to make the raid succeed, because fundamentally that it's not going to get the vehicles to the seawalls. It's not going to get the men to the seawalls. And once they're at those seawalls, even if you were lucky enough to theoretically be able to hit the seawall with a heavy naval artillery shell, bearing in mind that you're talking about battleships, so they're going to be shooting from 5 or 6 miles out, the circular area of probability would pretty much be from where the waves are hitting the beach to the seawall and beyond it, which means that half your CEP is your own men. So even if they can blow a hole in the wall, they're not going to, unless it's in the preliminary bombardment.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing I always thought about was, okay, you had a hard enough time driving the tanks on the beaches as it was. Never mind with 15-inch shell holes everywhere. I mean,
yeah. It's, there's basically it comes down to there were a lot of assumptions that turned out to be incorrect about how the men and the vehicles would handle the beach, and also the selection of the place to assault. Dieppe, the thing is, realistically speaking, I don't think even if Dieppe had been on the list of D-Day beaches, I don't think it would have succeeded. I mean, there's a lot of mythology, obviously, especially in the US around Omaha Beach, but you look at how close at times Omaha Beach came to almost not working. Obviously, we know it did in the end, but Omaha Beach, in a lot of ways, is a much, much better place to land than Dieppe, and that's in part influenced by what happens at Dieppe. So, yeah, I mean, even with all the extra stuff that was put together in 1944, I really don't think the Dieppe landings were ever going to succeed in any major way. You could obviously get small parties that might clear the beach and get some intel or get some results, which historically happened at Dieppe as well. But it was never going to work. But of course, it's easy to say that now because we know why it didn't work. That's not necessarily to say that at the time they knew that was going to happen.
Well, and the other thing too, I look at it and it's like, well, it's the same thing if they would have attacked. That's kind of why D-Day wasn't at Calais.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they chose the beach as well for D-Day. Whereas I think the way I've always written off D-Day or Dieppe is
Mm-hmm.
it was not done because it was the best plan. It was done because we needed to do something, so we might as well do this.
Yeah, and I mean it's also, it reflects the fact that this kind of operation really had never been done before in a modern context and actually succeeded, because on any kind of large scale, because the main large scale amphibious operational experience that everybody had to reference back to was Gallipoli.
Yeah.
And it's like, there were a long list of things they learned not to do at Gallipoli, but there was precious little that comes out of that campaign which points out this is what you should do, a positive, this was done right. So just because you've ticked off, I don't know, 50% of the things not to do list doesn't mean that you automatically know what the other 50% was or wasn't going to be.
Yeah, but I one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you about this was especially the feeling here, especially when I was growing up. Nowadays, I mean, you could probably walk up to 90% of Canada and say Dieppe, and they'll look at you funny, which is a sad state of affairs all in itself. But when I was growing up, the main thing was always blame the Navy. It was always the Navy wasn't enough, or it was the Navy's fault in some way. They never blame anything else. It's always been the Navy didn't do enough. They didn't supply the big enough ship. They didn't take it serious. The Royal Navy was scared of losing ships in the Channel. That's another one of the big myths, in my opinion.
Yeah, well, I mean, the Royal Navy did refuse to commit large-scale combatants to the operation because they were basically, this is coming off of the back of what had happened to Prince of Wales and Repulse. So, one, the Royal Navy is not exactly swimming in capital ships at that point, because again, it's this kind of the timeline that's involved. Yes, we're now 8 months into the part of World War II that has US involvement, but the US does not have the resources at this point to commit major assets to the European theater. The Navy is still recovering from but firstly from Pearl Harbor, but also recovering from Coral Sea, Midway, various other engagements. Obviously, Guadalcanal's only just kicked off, so they're committing large amounts of assets to there as well. So that means that the Royal Navy is sitting there going, okay, we are still trying to fight the entirety of basically Europe, because you've got Germany plus all of its conquests, and we're trying to fight Italy in the Mediterranean. So we've got at least 3 distinct theaters: North Sea, Atlantic, with all the subs, and the Mediterranean. Plus we've got to cover the Indian Ocean, the South Atlantic. We've still got to kind of try and hold the line a little bit in the East. Some resources are being diverted back there to fight the Japanese, and so on and so forth. And, playing into that, by this point, pretty much all the major Royal Navy capital ship losses that were going to happen have now happened. But the last few of them, like Prince of Wales and Repulse, have, relatively speaking, only just happened. And a lot of the stuff that would be replacing those losses, or at least making up for them slightly, so the implacable class carriers for covering carrier losses, Duke of York, Anson, and Howe for the King George V, which will partly cover the loss of Hood, Repulse, Prince of Wales, Barham, etc. A lot of these assets aren't yet online. So at this stage, bearing in mind that you've lost Hood, you've lost Prince of Wales, Duke of York is basically in the state that Prince of Wales was in at the time of Bismarck sailing. Your only operational fast capital ships at this point are the battlecruiser Renown and HMS King George V. You cannot, in a scenario where Tirpitz, Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, Littorio, Vittorio Veneto, and for that matter, even some of the refitted Italian older ships, in the scenario where all these ships exist, you cannot risk one of your two fast capital assets for what is essentially a gigantic raid.
Yeah.
And then, what else have you got to hand? Nelson and Rodney, well, you need those as the heavy backup for your fast assets. The remaining Queen Elizabeths, well, they're all pretty much down in the Mediterranean trying to hold off the Italians, which means you're down to the Revengers, and the Revengers, again, the ones that are left, are sitting on convoy duty, hoping against hope that this will be enough to deter Scharnhorst and company from coming out to attack them. So you don't have the capital assets, even if you were going to risk them in an environment where you can't assure air superiority, which at the time they couldn't. The Royal Navy did ask the Royal Air Force, can you ensure air superiority over the beaches? And unsurprisingly, the Royal Air Force turned around and said, well, actually, no, we can't, which was a fair enough assessment. The big grinding down of the Luftwaffe hadn't happened yet. And whilst this is France, it's occupied France, so you're essentially operating on the Germans' front doorstep. A lot of the problems that the Luftwaffe had just had in the Battle of Britain were now reversed if you're talking about RAF fighters over France. So, yeah, no battleship assets, no battlecruiser assets, and the cruisers likewise have taken, there's a fair bit of losses, there's a fair bit of damage. There's still a need to escort the capital ships, which, as we covered, are elsewhere. There's a need to escort convoys. There's a need to patrol in the South Atlantic and the Indian Ocean against raiders. Even if they'd wanted to divert significant assets to this operation, they really would have struggled to find some. As compared to 2 years later, when they've got American assets come in, they've got the replacement stuff that's been under construction, they've got pretty much air superiority. It's a completely different picture once you get to D-Day. So people can't imagine that this is going to be D-Day 2 years early.
No. And the other thing I've always thought about is, okay, let's say they did get the battleships in there or a heavy cruiser. And they lost, let's say the British managed to scrounge together 3 heavy cruisers to throw in there, and they lost 2. But Dieppe was successful. Would the gains of Dieppe be worth losing the 2 heavy cruisers? In reality,
I mean, it depends. It depends what they gain, but realistically, in terms of what they could have gotten out there, because they wanted to investigate some of the radar German coastal radar stations and everything, it wouldn't have been worth it, because heavy cruisers are few and far between at this stage. I mean, the British didn't have that many of them to start with, and at this point, York and Exeter are both gone. York's been hit by Italian Mars boats, or very shortly is going to be. Exeter's been sunk as part of ABDA command. Cornwall and Dorsetshire have been sunk as by the Japanese as part of the Indian Ocean raid. A number of others have been damaged. And, given that you're just talking for the Royal Navy about the County class and the York class are pretty much now out of action, losing what would amount to over 20% of your remaining heavy cruisers, it's not viable for a bit of information about radar that you could get from somewhat less costly perspectives elsewhere. Plus, of course, the opportunity cost of but it's also the opportunity cost of, if you've got 3 heavy cruisers, which presumably will have to train for this operation, they'll have to stick around in the English Channel. They're actually then part of the operation, and then any one that survives is going to have to go back and get prepared. That that's 3 heavy cruisers, even if they all survived out of action for at least a month or two, and while they're not in other locations, what is the Axis going to do in those areas?
Yeah.
You know, which troop convoy are you going to not escort?
But we don't like to think of that. We sit there and go, well, it's but I never understood why the Navy got the blame.
Well, I think the problem is you kind of divide it up into the 3 services. Now, the army, whether it be British or Canadian, primarily Canadian forces, you know, they got landed on the beaches. They've done their level best. No one can say with their right mind that the troops on the ground didn't do their absolute best to reach their objectives. So you can't blame them. If you're going to blame anyone when it comes to ground forces, you have to go much higher up the food chain. And of course, the higher up the food chain you are, the better you are at deflecting the blame onto somebody else. Then you look at the air forces, and the RAF had rightly said, we can't guarantee air superiority over here. So, you know, if they've already told you you're not getting air superiority guaranteed, then the fact you didn't get air superiority, you can't really blame them for suffering something they told you were going to suffer anyway. Yes. And again, to their credit, the RAF did show up in fairly large numbers. They did do some ground attack missions. They did take on the German aircraft, although again, as happened with the Dunkirk evacuation, just because you didn't necessarily see aircraft directly over the beaches doesn't mean they weren't involved, because if one RAF squadron intercepts a German squadron and it's 30 miles away from the landings, no one at the landings is going to see that. But they don't see the RAF presence, but then they also don't see the German bombers that might have been coming for them. So all in all, the Air Force, it's pretty hard to say anything especially negative about them. Obviously, there's all sorts of command and coordination issues, which they're not unique to Dieppe. They'll continue in the future, but and that kind of leaves the Navy. It's like, so they're the only ones that you can really scapegoat at this point. And because the Navy have turned around and made some rather specific refusals, like refusing to commit capital assets, and the fact that, again, exactly who gets the blame in the immediate aftermath as compared to who gets the blame in historiography later on, are two very different things. Yeah. And that kind of comes back to what we were saying earlier of the fact people are very, very heavily influenced, I think, through the lens of the future landing operations, where you do have battleships and cruisers and dozens of destroyers throwing gunfire downrange. And because naval gunfire support is quite important at D-Day, and it's quite important at in the Pacific, people then kind of retroactively go, well, if naval gunfire support, particularly heavy gunfire support, was so important to these landings being successful, then the fact it wasn't present at this other earlier landing must therefore be the problem. Because we can't pin the blame on anything else. Whereas realistically, as we said, if you want to blame anyone, you're going to be blaming the higher ups who thought it was a good idea to launch an invasion of a shingle beach in the first place.
Yeah. It's just like the old argument of the Somme. You can't blame the poor guys that ran against the machine gun.
Yeah.
So, but and the other thing I look at from because the other war cry, especially here in Canada, is our men gave their lives so that D-Day could happen. Right. Without our soldiers giving their lives at Dieppe, D-Day would have failed. Right. That's the myth that has come out of the Dieppe raid. I guess that's the overall. But they're two different points in time. Like, I don't know if D-Day would have been as successful if it was the same situation where the Germans still had an air force to speak of. The United States wasn't exactly in the West, in the European theater. and it was mainly left up to the British. I don't know if D-Day would have succeeded either.
I mean, it's kind of it's in the details. It's a bit of a difficult one because, on the one hand, there were a lot of lessons learned from the Dieppe landings. Whether or not those lessons could have been learned from other less costly operations is a bit of an open question because, of course, thanks to Dieppe, there wasn't a need for other smaller raids for learning operations. So it's a bit of a, something you can never 100% prove. The flip side, of course, is that because of it being such a large scale operation, it meant that the Germans got a fairly good idea of how the Allies, at least in 1942, would have gone about an amphibious landing. So it was kind of a stress test for the German defenses. So I think when it comes to that, there's kind of, you can argue it one of two ways. You could argue that either it's all a bit of a wash because whilst we learned lessons, so did the Germans. So their beach defenses were upgraded when our upgraded attack power came in 1944. Or you could argue that perhaps it lulled the Germans into a false sense of security because once they saw what a disaster Dieppe was, they maybe went, oh, well, we need to tweak one or two things here, and here. But broadly, we've shown we can hold off an amphibious attack. And maybe then that meant they weren't quite as ready as they might have otherwise been if they just stayed in a state of unknown paranoia up until 1944. But I suspect that it's probably closer to the former, with it being a bit more of a wash than the latter, because we know the Germans were constantly upgrading their defenses in northern France. So you can't really point to the Germans suddenly stopping construction of the Atlantic Wall and going, oh, yeah, well, no, we'll be fine. There were reasons the Atlantic Wall construction slowed down, but that was more to do with the Eastern Front than anything else.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, I would say that from the Allied side, there probably is some merit to the idea that not necessarily that it meant that D-Day succeeded, but it meant that D-Day was less costly.
Yeah,
because there were definitely things that went wrong, and you learning from those lessons, the Allies were then able to go, okay, well, we're going to, change things up a bit. We're going to develop specialist armored vehicles for landings. We're not going to go after shingle beaches. Maybe make sure if the seawall isn't that quite so high at the back. And the main thing, which actually both is a lesson out of Dieppe and a lesson out of the Channel Dash, which is roughly contemporaneous, is the coordination between Army, Navy, and Air Force needed massive amounts of upgrading, which, that certainly was a lot better at D-Day. But I would say, I mean, it's not a perfect analogy, but perhaps given the various lessons that were learned at Dieppe and how they were implemented and where they were implemented on D-Day, a very loose analogy could maybe be said that Omaha Beach, minus the fact they did have some heavy naval gunfire support, but Omaha Beach is probably what most of D-Day would have looked like without Dieppe, whereas all the other beaches are what D-Day was with the lessons of Dieppe. So I wouldn't say that Dieppe meant that D-Day succeeded, but it certainly meant that a lot more Allied troops came home after D-Day than it perhaps would have happened otherwise.
Yeah. So from a naval perspective, coming out of Dieppe, because we know like the landing, like they learned the landing crafts and stuff. From a naval perspective, what were the major takeaways coming out of Dieppe for because they did put the destroyers in, and they did, so they didn't just show up with a canoe.
Yeah.
What were the major takeaways from the Navy?
So, one of the absolute biggest takeaways, of course, was the need to coordinate better with the Air Force and with the troops. Another one was the need. Another one was the need for a considerably larger and more uniform landing craft element. So we mentioned earlier about the fact that a lot of the LSIs at this point were cobbled together out of whatever ferries and so forth they could get their hands on. So a more and more uniform landing craft, and also perhaps also specialized landing craft for support. So so you see the landing ship gun, the landing ship rocket, etc., or landing craft rocket, landing craft gun. These are developed. So there's a lot of refinement, sort of, and fine adjustment about what kind of craft you want right on the shoreline. The destroyer gunfire support, where it existed, tended to do okay-ish, but there was a lot, as I said, there's a lot of different amphibious operations, from this to Guadalcanal to all sorts of things, where you could point to naval gunfire support developing. So maybe that's not a specific takeaway from Dieppe. I wouldn't necessarily say the need for capital ship grade fire support came out of Dieppe, because as we covered why the Navy was aware that it would be useful, but we covered why they didn't put it in.
Yeah.
And again, there were subsequent operations between Dieppe and D-Day where naval gunfire support was able to be present in heavier calibers. So I think from a naval perspective, it was mostly re-emphasizing, the check boxes of, we need anti-aircraft, lots of anti-aircraft fire support. We need better and more uniform ships for landing, and we need more direct support in the landing role using adapted landing craft. But it's kind of, I suppose, if you split the seaborne element into the ocean-going combatants, the destroyers, even the MTBs and MGBs to a certain extent, and so forth, and then you have the amphibious element, which is all the landing ships and landing craft, a lot more is taken about how to refine the amphibious vessels than about how to utilize the ocean-going combatants.
Okay. So so a lot of it was more like, okay, we need better landing craft because this is ridiculous, kind of idea.
Yeah. The other big one, which is technically a naval element because it's still at sea, is the realization that you need an artificial harbor, because a pre-built harbor, something that's been around for decades or centuries, is a very obvious area to attack, very obvious area to land, which means that the Germans will fortify and defend it. The same way as has happened at Ostend and Zeebrugge in World War One. But if you landed in an area that didn't have a harbor, you were subject to all sorts of sea conditions, which could be highly variable and completely mess things up for you. So that I would say, if there's any one major naval realization, it was the idea that we need to be able to bring our own harbors, because that then allows you to attack pretty much wherever you want, as long as there's a beach that you can land the men on, because you can bring your own sheltered area for not just bringing in more men, but also to resupply and rearm the men that you do have in the first wave, and bring out casualties and so forth. It's so much easier when you have your own harbor to build.
Yeah, and the other thing too, the major differences between Dieppe and D-Day is Dieppe was never meant to be attack and hold, whereas D-Day was. Dieppe was attack, get information, and pull out. They were never meant. It wasn't like Dieppe was an invasion of occupied France. That was never the goal. And sometimes, depending on who you listen to, it can be it's spun that way, and it's never made any sense because it was never the goal. It was just
no, you're not going to liberate the entirety of France with 5,000 troops, no matter how good they are. And I think this is another one of the things. It's when you look at D-Day, as much as you have better landing craft and on some beaches specialist armored assault craft, adapted tanks and so forth, and as much as the terrain is better, and as much as you've got all the harbors, etc., one of the biggest things at D-Day that helps it to succeed is the fact that the first wave comes in And if something happens to them, the second wave is coming in and the third wave is coming in. And the fact is, unless you can kill the entirety of wave 1 before wave 2 arrives, by the time that wave 3 arrives, you've got even more people and more tanks shooting at you on the beach than you had before. And eventually the defenders with a limited number of people, limited amount of ammunition, etc., they're going to crack. Whereas with Dieppe, if you could contain those initial landings, there's no further landings to back them up. It's kind of once those men are on the beaches, every man that goes down is one man less you have to fight, because there's no further reinforcements. And that also influences the battle strategy, because the whole thing is predicated on there being an exit strategy to get everybody out. And whereas obviously at D-Day, although there is a kind of a plan B, an emergency plan in case they do have to evacuate the beaches, most of the planning goes into sending in the next wave and the wave after that and the wave after that and so on and so forth. So it's where you're always intending to leave, you're going to use a slightly different balance of assets anyway, as well. I mean, it's the same reason when you look at, although it's not my specialization, but I'm sure that perhaps some of the listeners will know this even more than me. But when you look at forward scouting elements in World War II on land, the forward scouting elements are not, Sherman jumbos and Churchills. They're armored cars and light tanks and some more lightly protected, more rapidly moving vehicles, sometimes armored, sometimes not. But their purpose is to go in to do something and then get out again.
Yeah.
But if you have a column of, say, Daimler armored cars, they'll do superbly well in the scouting role. If they run into a panzer division, they run or they die.
Yeah.
Whereas if you have a bunch of Sherman Fireflies or Easy 8s or something, and a division of those runs into a panzer division, they can stand and fight, and proportionally will take fewer casualties, but they're going to be much less useful in the scouting role. And then similarly, if your ultimate goal is to get in, get something and get out, there are certain assets and tactics that you're not going to commit to an operation like that.
Yeah. All right. Well, I want to thank you for your time today. And I think we've had a good conversation on Dieppe. I hope everybody found it informative. And once again, Drac's channel is in the description. Go to him for all things naval. He does wonderful dry docks that help entertain me on Sundays, especially the end of the month extravaganzas. How you sit there for 4 hours, I have no idea. But I would like to thank everybody for joining us. Thank you, Drac, for joining us again. And with that, thank you all and have a great day.
See you later.